Welcome to Synergy 129, getting ahead of global regulations and compliance with Citrix. I am Joe Nord. I am Director of Product Management, working out of Citrix Fort Lauderdale. I worry about requirements for a bunch of products, notably apps and desktops with influence across the company on what it is we're building and where we're going. With me is Florin.
Hey, Florin Lazurka, thanks for joining us today. I'm part of the technical marketing team dealing with security, so dealing with security events, evangelism, anything involving talking to customers about what our security capabilities are.
With that, let's get going. Now, standard slides to start us off. This is Synergy 129. As you get towards the end, there'll be opportunities for rating the session in the mobile app, and we ask that you do. It helps Florin and I have opportunities to come back and talk to people about subjects such as certification in the future. So at the end, please do that, and we appreciate your support. And I am JH Nord on Twitter. You can follow me here for lots of information on Citrix and security and compliance, and occasionally information on how to manipulate thermostats in hotels. Thank you. Okay. And Florin's handle as well.
I'm there as well.
All right, so certifications that we care about in on-premises world and cloud world. We're going to introduce this a little bit of where we are and where we're going. And Florin, why don't you take over?
Sure. So the top three that we usually hear about are PCI, right? So payment card industry, HIPAA, and now in the last couple of years we see a lot about data privacy as well as GDPR. We actually have Peter here, our Chief Digital Privacy Officer, and he'll speak to us, Peter Lefkowitz, he'll speak to us a little bit later about the Trust Center, and he's got got questions for him about Citrix and privacy and security. He's a good resource. Throw you on the spot there. So PCI, HIPAA, and GDPR. So let's start off, PCI DSS, right? So anyone here subject to compliance, attestation? Got one, two, all right, three. All right, so it's just high-level overview for those that are not. You know, it's payment card industry, data security standard. We're talking about it's a voluntary one that these merchants that use credit cards, that store credit card numbers, that transmit, that process credit card numbers are subject to. Now, you may think this might just be, you know, retail.com, e-commerce, but a lot of places use credit cards, including Citrix, right?
Yeah, I kind of get this question, and to get into some of the terms of PCI compliance, PCI DSS certification and what it means. I get the questions, product manager, is Citrix PCI compliant? And I always respond, oh yes, we are. You actually can buy a license on Citrix.com using a credit card, and our use of that credit card number does meet the requirements of PCI DSS. But that's never really the question that people were asking. What they were asking was, is your environment suitable for me to host my credit card data in the cloud? Because it's the customer's environment that ultimately gets certified by their QSA auditor and by their issuing bank as suitable for holding credit card data and releasing that. We're going to get a little more into on-premises versus cloud. Yep. But there's a lot of vendor guidance we've had in the past for PCI, and that's taken us a long way. Some things change as we head to cloud.
So not only we're looking at Citrix and Citrix Cloud and so forth, how can we help our customers, but even government entities that process like fines, parking ticket fines, right? Clinics that do both HIPAA and they're processing customer information around credit cards, right? They may have overlap there. So PCI is not just something that's simple, just e-commerce.com type of stuff. And when we look at the overview, high-level overview, there's basically 12 general rules, and I think we may have a couple of people in the room here that had an influence on some of these rules, right? They all have a subset of different requirements. For example, the number one, installing and maintaining a firewall configuration. That's a number of different specifications that are required. But the general goal here is creating a protected zone that has access control, that has authentication, that has auditing, being able to protect that credit card holder data, right? So how do you do this with a Citrix environment, right? So when we look at that, not only is it technical, but we also have policy and operations, right? Having the right policies in place and having the right operations to manage this environment. So, the goal is to create this secure network zone that's away from, what keeps the credit card data away from people that shouldn't have access, a need-to-know type of scenario. So you have internal users, then maybe even external users. That's another use case. And you have this credit card data, right? So first we go and say, well, let's add the firewalls, right? We have a number of partners that we work with firewalls, but let's add a gateway to connect to this environment where we do two-factor authentication, we do auditing, we have the capability of encrypting that traffic from this secure zone to the endpoints. And let's keep the endpoints out of this picture completely. Don't actually transfer any of that credit card data to those endpoints, right? Do not transfer any of that sensitive information to that endpoint. That's the credit card CVV number, the expiration date, all that stuff that's kind of sensitive, right? So we have this environment that at this point becomes out of scope, right? So the goal here, not only protect that data, but also reduce the scope of the audit by making those endpoints out of the scope of the audit. Now, when you're going additional, right, you look at this PCI type environment, it's using Citrix apps and desktops, so you're giving a jump point for your end users to connect to the environment. Using Storefront, you can protect Storefront with a web app firewall as well. Any other resources that are on there that are web resources, you can protect it with a web app firewall.
One thing I'd like to draw a little attention to, I mean, I get a lot of inquiries often from merchants that were a lower tier. They didn't have as much of a requirement on their credit card processing. But as they grew and became larger, the expectations of their bank and the QSA grew as they hit a higher PCI tier. And they're under pressure to get their environment qualified for PCI DSS certification. And their very common usage of Citrix Zen App and Zen Desktop to localize the database of the credit cards away from the majority of the company's network. They have their auditor in and they're trying to get their environment qualified, but qualifying their entire company would just be an overwhelming problem. And using hosted app and desktop and NetScaler, they can subnet the network that holds the credit card data so that there's no IP connectivity between the two. Exactly. And that's what's been very successful over a very long period of time for payment card with Citrix apps and desktops.
Exactly. You're creating this dedicated secure zone for these transactions to take place, and that data doesn't transfer over or bleed over to other networks. Now, let's talk about PCI in the cloud.
Yeah, PCI in the cloud, from the slide a minute ago, it was, I described the network that holds the credit card data and the access. It's not really an external connection, it's an internal connection, but the separation of networks between the two. That entire environment is in the customer environment. So in the historic on-premises world of payment card industry, it's all customer space that's seeking the certification of their auditor. So as a vendor, as Citrix, we're providing vendor guidance on how to deploy it, but we're not actually involved in the certification of the environment. In the cloud, that model kind of changes because Citrix is involved in some of the aspects of the publishing, what applications are available to what users. We Citrix can't see the data, but from a PCI auditor perspective, they start to ask many questions about the cloud. It's still the customer's environment that's getting the PCI certification, but they're looking to Citrix to prove our readiness on the cloud portion of that. And many have probably heard of an attestation of compliance. That's what they're asking for. And we'll go through a bunch of things on where we are and where we're going as this pitch goes on.
All right, so now we're looking at HIPAA. We're talking about Health Insurance Portability Protection Act. Who's covered by both PCI and HIPAA? Anybody? Wow, we got one, okay. Anyone just HIPAA? A few, all right. So Citrix is quite established in the healthcare industry, and a lot of hospitals. My mother-in-law's hospital also uses Citrix to get access to their records and so forth. So definitely something that we see as a large use case. Now, when we're dealing with HIPAA, right, we're looking at the primary organizations that are impacted by this regulation, this law or this act, is healthcare providers, the insurers, anybody that's dealing with EPHI, right? So protected healthcare information. Now there's two components of this. One is around privacy, and that is a foreshadowing of our next conversation, right? What is something that's identifiable, it's personal information. Then we're looking at the security rule, and that actually has a bit more prescriptive on the physical, the technical, and the administrative safeguards that are needed to be in place. And that was augmented with the data breach notification, or HITECH. So besides having all these standards and safety controls in place that protects patient names and it protects the email and physical addresses, because when you look at healthcare, it's a treasure trove of information, right? You're looking at anybody dealing with healthcare information has social security numbers, has credit card information, has addresses, has pretty much a complete breakdown of an individual, right? So it's highly targeted information, fingerprints, images, and so forth. So this is where you want to protect that data. As I mentioned, this was augmented with the data breach notification. So when looking at the actual technical safeguards, similar on a few fronts, right? We're talking about encryption, we're talking about access control. There's some items that are there that are specific to healthcare, like an automatic log off, right? You're working at a station, you walk away, imagine it's a nurse working at a station, walks away, that station needs to shut off after a while so that there's no, or the access needs to log off so that the information and the access is not open for a long time. But we also have something like emergency access. Should access to the whole environment fail, power outage or whatever, there's got to be another way in to get that medical data, because we're talking about life and death situations here, right? So similar concepts, integrity of the data, encryption of the data, confidentiality and so forth, access control, auditing, but now we have a couple other things that look at the timeliness of that data. But when we're looking at a Citrix environment, it's a very similar scenario. We're building an environment that is creating a secure zone for that data to stay off of endpoints and to stay in a zone that is accessible by a select few, right? So you're having the accountability and the auditing and the encryption involved, and you're adding on their session log-on times, expirations, and so forth. And you're providing another set of controls to make sure that these environments are always available, things like GSLB and so forth. Anything you want to add here?
Yeah, it's a very similar picture to what we had before. It's the next slide I really want to get into. We touched on attestation of compliance. If you look up on many of these certifications, what the PCI, what HIPAA are talking about are certifying that the customer environment is ready. But for the cloud piece, the auditors are looking for an attestation. That is where another auditor, perhaps the same, but arguably independent, has looked at the cloud environment and deemed it suitable for HIPAA data in the cloud and for payment card with some control of that environment occurring through the cloud. And for Citrix Share File and Write Signature, there's a link here to the auditor's report for our attestation of compliance for Share File on HIPAA. What I pick up on that is that it's Share File and Write Signature, it's not Workspace. Now you can imagine that's an environment where we're headed, and one I intend to solve for the full suite of products. But that's kind of a visionary statement of where I wish to take it.
So let's look at some privacy regulations. Most notably in the last 2 years, the General Data Protection Regulation is the one that stands out. If you're not familiar with it, just a quick recap. It's a law that kind of unifies a few disparate laws and regulations and acts around the EU. Different countries had their own regulations or acts and laws that were put in place over the years. Some of them were pre-internet, pre-social media in terms of when they were written and their vision there. So not only did it normalize them, but it kind of brought it up to date. And it basically puts the onus on organizations to protect their customer data. It changes the way things are done in terms of consent. You might start seeing when you go to a web page that you get this automatic, hey, we're using cookies. I haven't seen that in a dozen years, but now it's automatically back, right? So that's part of it. Some organizations, they haven't been able to become compliant, quote, compliant. They've actually stopped service to IP addresses that are coming from the EU. I've seen that happen. Now, the couple things are, is gives the data subject, and this is going to be on the next slide as well, more control over their data, right? So their data subjects have additional rights and what they can do with that data. But the big thing that always stands out is that the fine system is a little heavier in terms of the amount that a organization can be fined. There's already been a couple of instances that I'm aware of. A company an organization out of Portugal and one out of Germany. Some hit with a larger fine than others based on their interaction with the regulators, based on how open they were with the breach, open with access, and how pretty much how much they cared, in my opinion. But we're looking at 2% and 4%. 4% of the global revenue, of the turnover of the revenue. So that's a fine that's so large that it's kind of built to reduce the amount of people, of time that's spent on like, well, do we secure this environment or do we just accept it? You know, it's the risk calculation.
Yeah, and Florian, I'd add, when we in Citrix products were looking to GDPR as it was coming online, we did significant inventories to figure out, I mean, it sounds wrong, but even to understand the data that we do collect, yep. You tend to think that the majority of the data is outside of our world, but there is information we have there. We have email addresses, we have names, and some of that data is personal data, and with EU users, even if you're talking about US-based services, as a global entity, the GDPR applies.
Exactly.
And we did significant work to figure out what we have and our retention policies for keeping it. And in some scenarios, the things we had to do to ensure compliance were really reducing our retention.
Yep. And
programmatically deleting stuff at a more aggressive schedule than we were doing before.
Yeah, and that ties into data subject rights. So there's a number of different data subject rights. I'm not going to go into complete depth on this, but the ability of the customer, the consumer, to ask to have their data deleted is one of them, right? Being able to go in and say, this data isn't correct, I need it to be updated, so rectify that data as well. But there's also, and I think Peter can speak to this a little bit later, as an organization, you're dealing with multiple vendors. What is the process there? All the agreements that are in place, what are they, especially if you're like a multi-tier using services, using additional providers, what are their, you're on the hook for that because, whatever their policies are, they kind of go on you as well. But then you have, just from an organizational standpoint, you may have the generic IT issue of data sprawl, right? There's data everywhere. There's data on endpoints, there's data on multiple servers, there's data on someone's Excel sheet that might be personal, there might be on a laptop that's lost or stolen, right? So how do you centralize that data? How do you put those controls in place to actually give visibility onto what's being stored? And then new to data privacy for the GDPR is the 72 hours notification, right? So as soon as you're aware, you have 72 hours to make an initial statement that there's been an incident and we're investigating and so forth. But that may happen before really you have an idea of, before the auditors are in, before the forensics are in, you may not know exactly what happened. So GDPR has like 99 different articles. It's a fairly lengthy document, but two that really stand out are Article 25 around access control and Article 32 around encryption and data isolation and data protection. As you can see, this kind of ties into some of the conversation we already had about ensuring availability, ensuring integrity, making sure that data isn't destroyed. Think things like ransomware that destroys data. Think things like making sure that data is not modified, so you got the integrity piece. And then people that shouldn't have access to it should not get access to it. So looking at the access control and encryption components of it as well. And when we look at building an environment, we've had a number of customers that have done this in the past where you may have multiple environments with multiple applications that have a different sensitivity of their data, right? You may have an HR application, you may have a financial application. You want to silo these environments so there is no data bleed. Now, there's another component of GDPR that talks about...
Even with that separation of data locality, if you will, each of those being individualized networks, you're still talking about single auth. So normally this type of configuration would include a federated authentication into the environment so that the users could authenticate once outside of this bubble to whatever their authentication source is, and at runtime access the apps within each environment with HDX bringing the user interface out to the user screen, but with no data movement between those zones possible.
Yeah. So you're looking at combining the ease of use, ease of access, and the user experience for the end user with getting access to a more secure environment with not common data as well as sensitive data as well. Like reducing the friction there for that access, not having multiple logins, having multiple login pages, and so forth. Now, GDPR is something, like as I mentioned, it's fresh in memory, but it's definitely not the end of it, right? So when we look at the privacy rules and regulation, it's been kind of an avalanche in the last few years. Prior to that 1981, I think there was something in the 1800s, right? So there's a huge kind of speeding up of requirements. So we're looking at 2018 are not only Brazil, California, 2019 Japan. So these are updates or new additions. And I think there was some talk about having, with California, that possibly could push a more of a national standard as well, right? So it's a domino effect that's speeding up. So I wouldn't expect any of this to go away, is my point.
Yeah. I'm going to go a little bit into historic certifications and cloud certifications, where we are, where we've been, where we're headed. The blue box here is talking about a lot of on-premises certifications. Common criteria, I'll dive into it in a little bit more detail, but it's a long time existed standard out of many governments for qualification for sales into their environment. Likewise, for FIPS 140, it says you have quality crypto suitable for use in environments that require that level of certification. And Section 508, which I believe has actually been renamed, which is usability compliance, to say that your software, even your admin interfaces, are done in a way that people with disabilities are able to utilize the software. And the other piece of this, in the green box, is more cloud-centric. SOC 2, and you'll see the little word priority there, that doesn't so much mean that we're working that in preference to other, but what it says is this is the one we're trying to get out as quickly as we can and first. And you also note the FedRAMP there, that we're working that in some large earnest, and John's here as well from our certifications group. Thanks. Common criteria. There are, I believe, 28 member nations. And the standard of common criteria says if you qualify for sale, if you've been tested and approved in one of the issuing countries, your software is approved for use in all of the member nations. So they have a common set of security requirements across them, and you can certify in one and sell to all. FIPS is separate. I'll get to that in a minute. And the picture here I kind of like. I've used it in some other pitches. If you've seen it before, I apologize. But Each one of these certifications of common criteria is like $1 million investment, years of work by dev teams. And when you get done, this is me at the Common Criteria conference a few years back, where I picked up certifications, one for NetScaler, one for apps and desktops, and I think that one of them was for Zen Server, the hypervisor there. And I was coming back on the bus carrying these 3 things, and they're laminated. You know, they weren't terribly fancy. But the guys across from me were like, I've been working for years in my company and I have nothing, and you're carrying 3. So I went up on stage. Great gig if you can get it. Go to a conference, go up on stage, get the award, and be done. Where I'm going with that is we've been doing that game for a long time, and we're good at it. Now, on premises, somebody told me once, everything with certification should be columns. Should be talking about everything in your company as having common criteria down the board, FIPS down the board on everything 508, and that's definitely the right answer. Now, I've got mostly green check boxes here, a couple of places where I don't have things filled in, but I've got common criteria on apps and desktops going back to MetaFrame XP in some year I can't even remember. FIPS compliance for quality crypto. 4.0, I mean, this stuff goes forever. On NetScaler, apps and desktops, and also usability. We've been turning the crank on this for a very long time, and we know how to do it. Now, we do it generally against LTSR releases, because the act of getting these things qualified is actually longer than a year and a half, couple years worth of work, and the CR cycle just doesn't mesh up with that, right? So we've been doing 7.6, 7.15, and now we're on the new numbering schemes. And I'm actively working to pull the crank on this again as we head towards the next LTSR. Now, one other thing I want to throw out there is our own crypto module. And in FIPS crypto, there are things of saying you did your crypto right, but there are a lot of things you have to say. One is that you use an approved, validated crypto module. And by having our own module, which we do in Citrix, it gives us a lot of flexibility on how we can embrace new platforms. Much of the work we did, for example, on, I got to use the right terms, endpoint management, benefited from having our own crypto module. And we're able to get FIPS compliance in that space. As we embrace cloud, a lot of the stuff we build is on top of Microsoft infrastructure, and the OS has validated modules already. But we also have our own SDK on top of that to make sure that we have one way of programming crypto within Citrix, and this has taken us a long way. And having our own module also allows us to be FIPS compliant in additional OSs that might not have validated crypto in the base system. This has been a win. We plan to grow on this and utilize it for additional puzzles that we can solve over time. Now, cloud certification. I touched on already on premises, and we've touched on payment card industry and HIPAA as really customer certifications, but attestations for the cloud vendor. And a lot of them have a lot of things in common. Yes, they're different certifications, and each have their, their own requirements and their own specific needs, but a lot of things are common. SOC 2 is about professional operations, and that's pretty common with what is expected out of ISO 27001. The actual requirements vary, but the idea of the system you need to build is pretty consistent between them. And IRAP is a similar standard being done out of Australia, and it has a lot in common with SOC 2. But the one that really unifies the whole world and brings together the secure execution environment along with the cloud operations is FedRAMP. That went one too far. So hopefully I can bring it back. Good. FedRAMP is a US government standard for qualification of purchases of cloud software, but it's really more than US government because it's a testament to the security readiness of cloud software as suitable for commercial as well. FIPS crypto is also a government standard, but many in insurance and many in finance insist on using FIPS validated crypto, and we've been successful with that on premise. Product manager looking after security in Citrix, my central mission is FedRAMP. So I said SOC 2's priority, that's still true, but where I'm setting all the requirements across the various product groups is FedRAMP, and that's a long journey and a pretty big road. I want to talk about the control families.
Yeah, so similar to the control families for PCI and for HIPAA, right? It's got a number of similar underlying themes around access control, looking at the processes and policies around incident responses as well, contingency planning. So it's a bit of, of regulations or policies that are borrowing from each other. But they all fall under similar concepts like ISO 27001. It's similar concepts. Some are just more specific to the industry. Now, when we're looking at NIST, we have a couple of things that are different, in terms of risk assessments and planning. They may not show up on the other ones as well, but fundamentally, they have a foundation that is very similar. We're looking at FedRAMP and JAB now. Yeah,
I touched on FedRAMP, and how many are familiar with the idea of FedRAMP, these terms, FedRAMP ready, FedRAMP in process or authorized? And it's a more complicated puzzle than even that, because you can get approved for FedRAMP by an agency authorization or by the Joint Authorization Board. There are all kinds of advantages and disadvantages of the different route. The one I'm chasing is the JAB. I don't have that yet, but that's where I want to go, because that pretty well gets me everything I could use across the entire sector. But the big thing here is that this is being pushed by Office of Management and Budget to make sure money is spent efficiently. It's similar to buying things for the government in the large. They don't want to have a whole bunch of different security standards, and for the cloud, it's FedRAMP. I predict this is going to be the standard of measure, not just for the government, but for commercial industry as well across cloud. Last year at Synergy, there was a chart in the keynote, this chart, I lifted it from the Synergy keynote of last year, that said, coming later this year, we will be providing Citrix virtual apps and desktops in Microsoft Azure Government. I put this slide up with a little checkbox to say we did what we said we would do. This has been stood up since July of last year. It's a first step on the FedRAMP journey, because there's chicken and egg things there. You got to have the cloud environment to get it qualified, and we have the cloud environment. We've done that. It's a little tricky to sell to that environment because they're not actually able to purchase that much until the certifications are in place, but it all happens in parallel as we run.
So we have time for Q&A, but before that, if we can get Peter's microphone on, and we can talk about the Trust Center. And anything else you may want to add. Stairs are on the other side.
Boy, that took some effort. Hi, everybody.
Will you introduce yourself a little?
Terrific. Okay. So I'm Peter Lefkowitz. I'm Citrix's Chief Privacy and Digital Risk Officer, and I have the pleasure of working with these two fine gentlemen, with John Boardwine, who's in our front row, who does our certifications and audits. One of the things we've been very focused on in the last year, because we know that privacy laws, security laws, the various standards and regulations are not going away, is making sure that we're as transparent as possible about what we do. So what we've done in the last year is we've stood up something called the Citrix Trust Center. You can just Google it. And what we have on the Trust Center is all of our form customer contracts, vendor contracts, all of the security standards we sign up to with customers for cloud, all of the security standards that we require upstream of all of our vendors. On the security side, we have details of documentation about our security services, including our certifications. Privacy and compliance, we get deeper into our policy base, all of our major agreements, and then at the end, we have product documentation that's specific to security, and then a link out from there to the page where we have much deeper documentation about our products, on the notion that given what we do for a living, all of our product documentation is going to speak to that security stack. What we've added recently is a place where customers and others can report security issues, vulnerabilities, and incidents, and also separate spaces for us to talk about security in the news. And you'll continue to see this site develop over time. It should have more in coming months about our bug bounty program, around our secure development standards, around our CVSS scoring, and we hope to just continue to enrich the information that we provide to you about how we do what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. All right, we have a few minutes left for Q&A. Don't be bashful. There's a microphone. Anything you can ask, you want to ask, you're wondering about, feel free. Who's going to be the first one? While we are waiting. Okay.
I do have some accounts in the education sector, so wondering, or I'm sorry, government, but would we have any plans for SIPA compliance from an ADC perspective?
It's probably for me.
Probably for you.
The fast answer and the correct answer is no, that it is lower on the priority list compared to the other certifications, but I don't mean to dismiss it as an appropriate goal. As we get the SOC 2, as we get FedRAMP, as we have ISO, the foundation requirements are similar across them all. And it would be perfectly reasonable and expected for us to get auditor qualification in those environments as well. Okay. So I kind of want to make that sound like a yes, but it's not one that I'm actively chasing.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Kurt, got any questions?
Take us home, Florin.
All right. So I just want to do a quick recap, right? So we spoke about some of the certifications and compliance standards that are most common, are very common. Some of the things around auditing and reducing the scope of an audit using a Citrix environment, get that data off of that endpoints. If the endpoint has to have data, how do you secure it, encrypt it? Where we're going and where we are from Joe, the Citrix Trust Center from Peter. I do ask you that you do review our session and give us feedback, and it should be available in your app now since you scanned in. Thank you very much.